In designating the tasks involved in formulating the question of being, we showed that not only must we pinpoint the particular being that is to function as the primary being to be interrogated, but also that an explicit appropriation and securing of correct access to this being is required. We discussed which being it is that takes over the major role within the question of being. But how should this being Sein, Dasein, become accessible, and so to speak, come into view in an interpretation that is comprehensible? The ontological priority that has been demonstrated for Dasein could lead to the mistaken opinion that this being Sein would also have to be what is primarily given ontologically, not only in the sense that such a being could be grasped immediately, but also that the prior giveness of its kind of being Seinsart would be just as immediate. True, Dasein is ontically not only what is near or even nearest, we ourselves are it, each of us. Nevertheless, or precisely for this reason, it is ontologically what is farthest. True, it belongs to its most proper being to have an understanding of being, and to sustain a certain interpretation of it. But this does not at all mean that the most readily available pre-ontological interpretation of its own being could be adopted as an adequate guideline, as though this understanding of being had to arise from a thematically ontological reflection on the most proper constitution of its being. Rather, in accordance with the kind of being belonging to it, Dasein tends to understand its own being sane in terms of the being seienden to which it is essentially, continually, and most closely related the world. In Dasein itself, and therewith in its own understanding of being, as we shall show, the way the world is understood is ontologically reflected back upon the interpretation of Dasein. The ontological priority of Dasein is therefore the reason why the specific constitution of the being of Dasein understood, in the sense of the categorical structure that belongs to it, remains hidden from it. Dasein is ontically nearest to itself, ontologically farthest away, but pre-ontologically certainly not foreign to itself. We have merely precursorily indicated that an interpretation of this being is confronted with peculiar difficulties, rooted in the mode of being of the thematic object, and the way it is thematized. They do not result from some shortcoming of our powers of knowledge or lack of an appropriate conceptuality, a lack seemingly easy to remedy. Not only does an understanding of being belong to Dasein, but this understanding also develops or decays according to the actual manner of being of Dasein at any given time. For this reason, it has a wealth of interpretations at its disposal. Philosophical psychology, anthropology, ethics, politics, poetry, biography, and historiography pursue in different ways and to varying extents the behavior, faculties, powers, possibilities, and destinies of Dasein. But the question remains whether these interpretations were carried out in as original and existential manner, as their existential originality perhaps merited. The two do not necessarily go together, but they also do not exclude one another. Existential interpretation can require existential analysis, provided philosophical knowledge is understood in its possibility and necessity. Only when the fundamental structures of Dasein are adequately worked out with explicit orientation toward the problem of being will the previous results of the interpretation of Dasein receive their existential justification. Hence the first concern in the question of being must be an analysis of Dasein. Then the problem of gaining and securing the kind of access that leads to Dasein truly becomes crucial. Expressed negatively, no arbitrary idea of being and reality, no matter how self-evident it is, may be brought to bear on this being in a dogmatically constructed way. No categories prescribed by such ideas may be forced upon Dasein without ontological deliberation. The manner of access and interpretation must instead be chosen in such a way that this being can show itself to itself on its own terms. And furthermore, this manner should show that being as it is initially and for the most part, in its average everydayness. Not arbitrary and accidental structures, but essential ones, are to be demonstrated in this everydayness, structures that remain determinative in every mode of being of factical Dasein. By looking at the fundamental constitution of the everydayness of Dasein, we shall bring out in a preparatory way the being of this being. The analytic of Dasein, thus understood, is wholly oriented toward the guiding task of working out the question of being. Its limits are thereby determined. It cannot hope to provide a complete ontology of Dasein, which of course must be supplied if something like a philosophical anthropology is to rest on a philosophically adequate basis. With a view to a possible anthropology or its ontological foundation, the following interpretation will provide only a few parts, although not inessential ones. However, the analysis of Dasein is not only incomplete, but at first also preliminary. It only brings out the being of this being without interpreting its meaning. Its aim is rather to expose the horizon for the most primordial interpretation of being. Once we have reached that horizon, the preparatory analytic of Dasein requires repetition on a higher, genuinely ontological basis. The meaning of being sane of that being seienden we call Dasein will prove to be temporality Zeitlichkeit. In order to demonstrate this, we must repeat our interpretation of those structures of Dasein that shall have been indicated in a preliminary way this time as modes of temporality. While it is true that with this interpretation of Dasein as temporality the answer to the guiding question about the meaning of being in general is not already the soil from which we may reap, it will nevertheless be prepared. We intimated that a pre-ontological being sane belongs to Dasein as its ontic constitution. Dasein is in such a way that by being sane, it understands something like being. Remembering this connection, we must show that time is that from which Dasein tacitly understands and interprets something like being at all. Time must be brought to light and genuinely grasped as the horizon of every understanding and interpretation of being. For this to become clear, we need an original explication of time as the horizon of the understanding of being, in terms of temporality as the being of Dasein which understands being. This task as a whole requires that the concept of time thus gain be distinguished from the common understanding of. The latter has become explicit in an interpretation of time, which reflects the traditional concept that has persisted since Aristotle and beyond Bergson. We must thereby make clear that, and in what way, this concept of time and the common understanding of time in general originate from temporality. In this way, the common concept of time receives again its rightful autonomy, contrary to Bergson's thesis that time understood in the common way is really space. Time has long served as the ontological or rather ontic criterion for naively distinguishing the different regions of being. Temporal beings, natural processes, and historical events are separated from atemporal beings, spatial and numerical relationships. We are accustomed to distinguishing the timeless meaning of propositions from the temporal course of propositional statement. Further, a gap between temporal being and supertemporal eternal being is found, and the attempt is made to bridge the gap. Temporal here means as much as being seiend in time, an obscure enough definition to be sure. The fact remains that time, in the sense of being in time, serves as a criterion for separating the regions of being. How time comes to have this distinctive ontological function, and even with what right precisely something like time serves as such a criterion, and most of all whether in this naive ontological application of time, its genuinely possible ontological relevance is expressed, has neither been asked nor investigated up to now. Time, especially on the horizon of the common understanding of it, has chanced to acquire this obvious ontological function of itself, as it were, and has held on to it until today. In contrast, we must show, on the basis of the question of the meaning of being which shall have been worked out, that and in what way, the central range of problems of all ontology is rooted in the phenomenon of time correctly viewed and correctly explained. If being is to be conceived in terms of time, and if the various modes and derivatives of being and their modifications and derivations are in fact to become intelligible through a consideration of time, then being itself, and not only beings that are in time, is made visible in its temporal, zeitlich character. But then temporal can no longer mean only being in time in der Zeitsein. The atemporal and the supertemporal are also temporal with respect to their being, this not only by way of privation when compared to temporal beings, which are in time, but in a positive way which, of course, must first be clarified. Because the expression temporal belongs to both praphilosophical and philosophical usage, and because that expression will be used in a different sense in the following investigations, we shall call the original determination of the meaning of being, and its characters and modes which devolve from time, its temporal determination. The fundamental ontological task of the interpretation of being, as such thus, includes the elaboration of the temporality of being temporalitat Dasein. In the exposition of the problem of temporality, the concrete answer to the question of the meaning of being is first given. Because being is in each instance comprehensible only in regard to time, the answer to the question of being cannot lie in an isolated and blind proposition. The answer is not grasped by repeating what is stated propositionally, especially when it is transmitted as a free-floating result, so that we merely take notice of a standpoint, which perhaps deviates from the way the matter has been previously treated. Whether the answer is novel, is of no importance and remains extrinsic. What is positive about the answer must lie in the fact that it is old enough to enable us to learn to comprehend the possibilities prepared by the ancients. In conformity to its most proper sense, the answer provides a directive for concrete ontological research. That is, a directive to begin its investigative inquiry within the horizon exhibited, and that is all it provides. If the answer to the question of being thus becomes the guiding directive for research, then it is sufficiently given only if the specific mode of being of previous ontology, the vicissitudes of its questioning, its findings, and its failures, becomes visible as necessary to the very character of Dasein.